The clash of steel echoed through the air as banners of rival lords snapped in the wind. The age of medieval warfare was one of relentless struggle, where power was carved out not only on open fields, but also behind the towering walls of castles that dotted the landscape. Knights, armored from head to toe, became the symbol of chivalry and dominance. Yet beneath the polished plate and mounted charge lay a world of brutal combat and unyielding sieges that defined this era. Armies gathered not for fleeting skirmishes, but for drawn-out campaigns that could last months, even years. When rival kingdoms or ambitious nobles sought to expand their reach, the fortress was both the prize and the obstacle. A castle was more than just stone walls. It was the heart of control over land and people. To bring down such a bastion, attackers would deploy every method at their disposal, battering rams to smash gates, trebuchets to hurl stones the size of men, and ladders that sent wave after wave of soldiers into a storm of arrows and boiling oil. For those inside, every day became a test of endurance, rationing supplies and bracing for relentless assaults, knowing that surrender could mean death or servitude. On the battlefield, knights rode as the armored fist of their lords, wielding swords, lances, and maces that crushed both armor and bone. Their charge, a thunderous line of cavalry, could break enemy formations in an instant, scattering foot soldiers who often fought with little more than spears and courage. Yet the knight's power was not absolute. Pikes, longbows, and crossbows turned many a nobleman's advance into a graveyard of shattered shields and fallen horses. Peasants, though poorly equipped, could form disciplined ranks that resisted even the fiercest mounted charges, showing that valor alone could not guarantee victory. The rhythm of war in the Middle Ages was one of alternating brutality and stalemate. Campaigns dragged on through seasons, with armies slowed by mud, famine, and disease as much as enemy swords. The siege became the most feared ordeal. Weeks of bombardment might breach a wall, but starvation often broke defenders long before the stone crumbled. Negotiations sometimes ended a siege, but more often they gave way to merciless sackings, where victors exacted their price in blood and fire. Honor and glory were the ideals knights swore to uphold, but in the smoke of battle and the hunger of sieges, those ideals were often drowned by survival. Warfare in this era shaped kingdoms and forged legends, yet it left scars on the land and its people that endured for generations. 4 generations. The age of castles and knights was not just a stage for heroism, but a brutal theater of endurance, where victory was as much about patience and cunning as it was about courage with sword in hand. The image of the medieval knight is one of the most enduring symbols of warfare in the Middle Ages. These mounted warriors, clad in shining armor, carrying lances, swords, and shields, represented not only the military power of their lords, but also the ideals of courage, loyalty, and honor. Yet behind the romantic image of the knight stood a figure of immense discipline, training, and brutality, forged by years of combat and hardened by the brutal realities of medieval war. The dominance of knights on the battlefield was not just a matter of individual heroism. It was the product of social hierarchy, economic power, and relentless training that set them apart from the common soldier. From a young age, boys born into noble families were groomed for the life of a knight. Starting as pages, they learned courtly manners, horsemanship, and the basics of combat. By adolescence, they served as squires, attending to established knights while mastering weapons such as the sword, mace, and lance. This training was more than physical. It was psychological, conditioning them to fight in close quarters where death was always near. When a squire proved his readiness, he was knighted in a ceremony that bound him by oath to serve his lord and uphold the code of chivalry. This code emphasized loyalty, bravery, and the protection of the weak, though in the chaos of war, these ideals often gave way to the savage necessity of survival. On the battlefield, the knight was a fearsome opponent. Encased in chainmail or later in plate armor, he was nearly invulnerable to most weapons of the common soldier. His horse, trained for war, was not simply a means of transport, but a weapon in itself, charging into enemy lines with the full force of man and beast. A line of knights in formation was like a wall of steel, advancing with thundering hooves and lowered lances, capable of shattering enemy ranks in an instant. This cavalry charge became the hallmark of knightly warfare, a tactic that exploited both the shock and awe of their presence and the raw physical impact of their momentum. Weapons were extensions of a knight's skill and status. The sword was the most iconic, a double-edged blade designed for both cutting and thrusting, symbolizing power and nobility. The lance, used in mounted charges, could pierce through armor and shields alike, while the mace and warhammer were brutal tools meant to crush metal and bone. Knights also carried shields emblazoned with coats of arms, not only as a means of protection, but as identifiers in the chaos of battle. Each weapon demanded strength, precision, and years of practice, making the knight a master of lethal artistry. The dominance of knights, however, was not absolute. Their armor, while protective, was heavy and exhausting, and their reliance on horses made them vulnerable in rough terrain. Against disciplined infantry armed with pikes or skilled archers with longbows and crossbows, even the most heavily armored knight could fall. Yet their presence continued to dominate warfare because of the fear and prestige they carried. To face a knight in single combat was often a death sentence for a poorly armed foot soldier, and entire battles could turn on the effectiveness of a knightly charge. Knights were also instruments of their lord's ambitions. They fought not only in pitched battles, but also in raids, skirmishes, and sieges, carrying the banners of their noble houses. Their loyalty was bound by oath and reward, and their role extended beyond combat into the enforcement of feudal order. They collected taxes, defended castles, and upheld the authority of the nobility. To peasants, knights were both protectors and oppressors, embodying the very power structure that defined medieval society. In time, the dominance of knights began to wane as new tactics and technologies emerged. The rise of professional armies, the use of disciplined infantry formations, and the devastating power of ranged weapons eroded the supremacy of armored cavalry. Yet during their height, knights embodied the very essence of medieval warfare, symbols of both the chivalric ideal and the harsh brutality of battle. Their armor gleamed in the sunlight, their lances leveled in deadly unison, and their charge thundered across the fields of Europe, leaving an imprint on history that still echoes today. Castles stood as the great monuments of medieval warfare, towering over landscapes with their stone walls, moats, and battlements. They were not only the residences of lords and kings, but also the very heart of military strategy during the Middle Ages. To control a castle was to control the surrounding land, its people, and its resources. More than mere strongholds, castles were symbols of authority and power, projecting dominance over rivals and serving as the last refuge in times of war. Their design and use shaped the course of medieval conflict, as attackers and defenders alike sought to test the strength of stone and the endurance of those within. The earliest castles were wooden motte and bailey structures, quick to build but vulnerable to fire and siege. Over time, these were replaced with formidable stone fortresses designed to withstand not just small raids, but full-scale assaults by rival armies. Walls rose thick and high, towers gave defenders commanding views, and gatehouses became deadly traps for attackers. Every part of a castle was designed with war in mind. Narrow arrow slits allowed archers to fire safely from within, while murder holes above gates enabled boiling oil, rocks, or arrows to rain down on any who dared breach the outer defenses. The moat, whether filled with water or dry, slowed advancing troops and made direct assaults more dangerous. For defenders, a castle was more than shelter. It was a weapon. Its walls absorbed the fury of trebuchets, its towers provided vantage points for archers, and its gates could hold against repeated hammering from battering rams. Inside, the garrison could survive for weeks or even months, provided supplies held. Castles were stocked with food, weapons, and fresh water, turning them into miniature fortresses of survival. The psychological power of a castle was immense. To approach its looming walls was to confront a statement of control, wealth, and unyielding resistance. For attackers, capturing a castle was often the true goal of a campaign. Open battles could decide the fate of armies, but to hold territory, one had to seize its strongholds. Sieges became the defining contests of medieval warfare. An army could not simply storm a well-defended castle. It required time, patience, and ingenuity. Siege engines such as trebuchets hurled stones large enough to shatter walls, while towers on wheels allowed attackers to scale battlements. Mining beneath walls, known as sapping, could cause entire sections to collapse, but it was slow and dangerous work. More often than not, attackers relied on starvation, cutting off supplies and waiting for defenders to surrender. These sieges could drag on for months, turning the castle from a fortress of strength into a prison for its inhabitants. Yet castles were not invincible. As weapons advanced, even the thickest walls could eventually be broken. The longbow allowed defenders to rain death on besieging troops, but in time, gunpowder artillery would revolutionize siege warfare, reducing castles to rubble with powerful cannons. Still, during their height, castles remained the core of strategy, forcing armies to reckon with their presence before advancing further. To bypass a hostile castle left an enemy stronghold behind, ready to strike its supply lines or harass reinforcements. This made them pivotal in campaigns, as both prizes and obstacles. Beyond the battlefield, castles played a role in maintaining order within realms. They served as administrative centers where lords collected taxes, administered justice, and enforced their will. To peasants, the castle was both a source of protection and a reminder of their subjugation. In times of peace, its walls offered safety from raiders and bandits, but in war, it became the heart of resistance, a symbol that their lords still held the land. Throughout the Middle Ages, the rise and fall of castles mirrored the rise and fall of kingdoms. Some were besieged and destroyed, others rebuilt stronger than before. Their ruins still stand today, silent witnesses to centuries of strife and endurance. They remind us that medieval warfare was not only about battles and fields, but also about sieges that tested human resilience against stone, hunger, and fear. The castle, with its towers and gates, was more than just a fortress. It was the embodiment of power in medieval Europe. To build one was to claim dominion, to hold one was to command respect, and to lose one was to watch authority crumble. In the brutal theater of medieval warfare, the castle stood as both the shield and the sword, shaping the strategies of knights, kings, and armies for centuries. The siege was the most brutal and unforgiving aspect of medieval warfare. Unlike the swift clashes of knights on an open battlefield, sieges dragged on for weeks, months, and sometimes even years, grinding both attackers and defenders into exhaustion. At the heart of these struggles was the castle, or fortified city, a symbol of defiance and control. To besiege such a stronghold was to engage in a contest of endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower. The brutal reality of sieges revealed the darkest side of medieval conflict, where starvation, disease, and desperation claimed more lives than the sword. When an army surrounded a fortress, the first step was to cut it off from the outside world. Supply lines were severed, farmland was torched, and villages in the surrounding area were plundered to feed the besiegers. The defenders, trapped within their walls, became prisoners of their own strength. While they looked down from towers and battlements with a sense of pride, they knew that every day without fresh provisions tightened the noose around their survival. Bread grew stale, meat ran out, and eventually the inhabitants were forced to eat horses, dogs, and even rats to stay alive. In the most desperate cases, historical records speak of cannibalism within starving garrisons, a horrifying testament to the cruelty of siege warfare. The attackers, however, did not simply wait. They built siege camps around the fortress, often protected by wooden palisades and trenches to guard against counterattacks. Within these camps, siege engines were constructed. Trebuchets that hurled massive stones, ballistae that fired giant bolts, and battering rams designed to shatter gates. The most fearsome of all were siege towers, great wooden structures rolled up to the walls, allowing soldiers to storm battlements at equal height. Each machine was a product of engineering and manpower, requiring carpenters, blacksmiths, and countless laborers to construct under constant fire from defenders. Arrows, rocks, and burning pitch rained down upon them, turning every advance into a deadly gamble. Defenders were not passive. They countered with their own weapons, using catapults to smash siege towers, pouring boiling oil, molten lead, or quicklime onto attackers, and unleashing deadly volleys of arrows from high ground. They repaired walls under the cover of darkness, reinforced gates, and dug countermines to collapse tunnels dug by besiegers. Every man, woman, and child inside a besieged stronghold had a role, whether it was carrying stones, fetching water, or simply enduring the hunger and fear that gnawed at morale. Time was often the true weapon of a siege. Stronghold. Diseases spread quickly in crowded castles and camps alike, striking down soldiers and civilians with equal cruelty. Dysentery, plague, and fever could kill more effectively than arrows or swords. For the besieging army, maintaining discipline and supplies was a constant struggle. Soldiers grew restless, mercenaries demanded pay, and harsh weather could force entire armies to abandon their efforts. In this way, some sieges failed not because the defenders repelled the attackers, but because the besiegers simply could not hold out any longer. When a fortress finally fell, the aftermath was often savage. If defenders surrendered before the walls were breached, they might be spared, though often forced into servitude or exile. But if attackers stormed the walls and took the castle by force, mercy was rare. Men were slaughtered, women and children enslaved, and the fortress looted and burned. Such brutality was meant to send a message to other strongholds: resist too long and suffer the price of defiance. Entire towns were wiped from the map after resisting sieges, their ruins left as grim warnings to others. Despite the cruelty, sieges shaped the course of medieval warfare more than any single battle. Victories were measured not only in slain enemies, but in captured fortresses that secured territories and solidified power. A siege was a war of patience, engineering, and unrelenting pressure, testing not only the strength of walls but the endurance of human spirit. The brutal reality of sieges reminds us that medieval war was rarely glorious. It was not the clash of swords in a tournament field, but the slow grind of hunger, the terror of bombardment, and the despair of watching hope fade with each passing day. In the end, a siege was a battle of survival, where the strongest stone was not always the wall, but the will of those who fought behind it. The clash between cavalry charges and infantry defenses was one of the defining features of medieval warfare, a deadly contest of speed and power against discipline and endurance. Knights on horseback represented the pinnacle of martial strength, their armored bodies and charging steeds capable of shattering enemy lines in an instant. Yet infantry, often less celebrated in the chronicles of history, developed tactics and weapons that could blunt or even annihilate these devastating assaults. The battlefield became a stage where the thunder of hooves met the immovable resolve of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each side seeking to prove its dominance. The knightly charge was a fearsome sight. Rows of mounted warriors, lances leveled, spurred their horses forward with a momentum that could crush armor, splinter shields, and scatter unprepared ranks. A single charge had the potential to decide an entire battle. The combination of mass, speed, and shock created chaos in enemy formations, and the psychological impact alone was often enough to send lesser-trained soldiers fleeing. To stand against such a charge required more than courage. It demanded discipline and careful planning. To win, infantry responded with innovation. The spear and the pike, weapons of reach and stability, became the frontline defense against charging knights. Soldiers trained to form dense formations, bristling walls of sharpened points aimed outward. Input: a charging horse, no matter how fierce, was reluctant to impale itself upon such barriers. If the line held firm, the momentum of the cavalry was broken, leaving the once feared knights vulnerable to counterattacks. Battles across Europe and beyond proved time and again that well-disciplined infantry could halt the thunder of cavalry, but only if their courage held and their formation did not break. Archery added another layer to this deadly equation. The English longbow in particular became infamous for its role in battles such as Crécy and Agincourt, where waves of arrows rained down on charging French knights. The longbow's power could pierce armor at distance, killing or maiming horses and riders and before they ever reached enemy lines. Crossbows, though slower to reload, offered similar penetrative strength and could be wielded effectively even by less trained soldiers. Against such weapons, knights found their heavy armor a double-edged sword. It offered protection but made them slower, more vulnerable when unhorsed, and easier prey for infantry. Still, cavalry remained formidable. Knights adapted, coordinating with infantry of their own, using combined arms to break enemy defenses. Cavalry charges were often timed to exploit weaknesses when infantry were already engaged, tired, or distracted by archery fire. Fire. A well-executed charge into the flank or rear of a formation could devastate even the most disciplined troops. In this way, the battlefield became a chessboard of timing and positioning, where cavalry and infantry each waited for the moment to strike. Terrain often decided the outcome of these clashes. Open fields favored cavalry, giving them space to build momentum and strike with full force. Rough ground, mud, or forests, however, hindered horses and gave infantry the advantage. Many commanders used the landscape as a weapon, luring knights into swamps or narrow passes where their charge lost its effectiveness. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish infantry under Robert the Bruce used marshy ground and schiltron formations of spearmen to repel repeated English cavalry charges, proving that knights, however powerful, could be defeated by clever tactics and terrain. The clash between cavalry and infantry also reflected deeper social divides. Knights were nobles, their training and equipment a privilege of wealth, while infantry were often commoners, farmers, or townsmen called to arms. Every battle between them was not just a contest of tactics, but a clash of classes. Victories of infantry over knights challenged the dominance of the nobility, hinting at changes that would reshape medieval society in the centuries to come. By the late Middle Ages, the balance began to tip further in favor of infantry. Larger, professional armies, equipped with pikes and powerful ranged weapons, reduced the supremacy of cavalry charges. Swiss pikemen and Flemish militias gained renown for defeating mounted knights, while the increasing use of gunpowder weapons eventually changed warfare entirely. Yet for centuries, the sight of armored cavalry thundering across a field remained the symbol of medieval battle, a living embodiment of power, wealth, and courage. The contest between knightly charges and infantry defenses defined the rhythm of countless battles, each side adapting to the other in a deadly dance of force and resilience. Knights sought to break through with speed and shock, while infantry relied on discipline and innovation to stand their ground. It was a struggle that produced not only victories and defeats, but also legends, shaping the story of medieval war as one of constant tension between mobility and steadfastness, between the thunder of hooves and the unyielding wall of men who dared to stand against them. The impact of medieval warfare reached far beyond the battlefield, shaping kingdoms, societies, and even the ideals of chivalry that defined the age. Knights, castles, and sieges were not only instruments of war, but also forces that molded the political, social, and cultural fabric of Europe for centuries. Every battle fought and every fortress built left echoes that transformed how people lived, how rulers governed, and how history remembered the Middle Ages. The legacy of this period is not just one of bloodshed, but of enduring influence on power, order, and identity. At the heart of this impact was the way warfare defined kingdoms. Control of castles meant control of land, and land was the foundation of medieval power. Nobles who held strongholds could resist kings, while monarchs who secured fortresses extended their authority over vast territories. The constant struggle for dominance through wars and sieges created shifting borders and alliances, carving out the political map of medieval Europe. Entire dynasties rose and fell on the outcome of battles, and military success often legitimized a ruler's claim to the throne. Victory in war was not just about survival. It was about creating the very identity of a kingdom. Warfare also influenced the everyday lives of ordinary people. For peasants who made up the bulk of the population, war meant more than distant battles. It brought destruction to fields, villages, and livelihoods. Armies needed supplies, and often they took them by force, leaving famine and ruin in their wake. Sieges cut off trade and brought starvation not only to soldiers but to civilians trapped within walls. At the same time, castles offered protection in times of crisis, giving villagers a place to flee when invaders approached. Thus, war was both a curse and a shield, shaping the rhythms of life in ways that extended far beyond the clash of armies. The knight, central to medieval warfare, left a mark on society that extended into culture and ideals. The code of chivalry, though often more aspirational than real, became a powerful influence. Knights were expected to embody loyalty, honor, and service, not only to their lords, but also to the church and to the weak. Literature of the time, from Arthurian legends to chansons de geste, celebrated these ideals, weaving them into the fabric of medieval identity. Yet on the battlefield, the reality was harsher. Pillaging, cruelty, and the slaughter of civilians were common. The tension between the ideal of the noble knight and the reality of war created a lasting cultural legacy, one that still colors how we imagine the Middle Ages today. Warfare also drove innovation. The need to overcome castles led to advances in engineering, from more powerful trebuchets to improved mining techniques. Defenders responded with thicker walls, angled bastions, and new fortification designs. The arms race between attackers and defenders pushed medieval technology forward, laying foundations for later military science. Similarly, the clash between cavalry and infantry forced tactical evolution, leading to the rise of professional armies and disciplined formations. By the end of the Middle Ages, the dominance of knights had faded, replaced by broader military systems that reflected the changing needs of kingdoms. Religion, too, was deeply intertwined with medieval warfare. The Crusades, framed as holy wars, carried knights and kings across continents, leaving lasting scars and connections between Europe and the Middle East. The Church sanctified wars, offering spiritual rewards for participation, while at the same time attempting to restrain violence through measures like the peace of God. This intersection of faith and war gave medieval conflict a spiritual dimension, one that justified conquest while shaping the values of those who fought. The long-term impact of medieval warfare was the gradual centralization of power. As kings found ways to fund standing armies and reduce reliance on noble knights, the feudal system began to weaken. Warfare had revealed both the strengths and limitations of feudal levies, pushing rulers toward more direct control of military force. This shift helped create the foundations of the modern state, where centralized authority replaced the fragmented rule of lords and barons. In memory and legend, medieval warfare continues to resonate. The image of the knight in shining armor, the towering castle on a hill, and the desperate siege have become symbols of an age defined by both brutality and grandeur. These stories, passed down through chronicles, ballads, and ruins that still stand today, remind us that war in the Middle Ages was not just about battles, but about shaping the destiny of entire societies. The lasting impact of medieval warfare lies in its dual nature. It was destructive, bringing famine, fear, and death to countless lives. Yet it was also constructive, forging kingdoms, inspiring ideals, and driving innovation that would shape the future of Europe. The clash of swords and the thunder of hooves may have faded into history, but their echoes continue to define our understanding of the medieval world. Medieval warfare was a struggle of endurance, courage, and strategy, where knights thundered across battlefields, castles loomed as symbols of defiance, and sieges dragged armies and civilians alike into the harshest trials of survival. It was an age where innovation clashed with tradition, where the ideals of chivalry stood in sharp contrast to the brutal reality of war, and where the fate of kingdoms was decided not only by the sword, but by patience, cunning, and resilience. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of these battles remain etched into the stones of ruined castles and the legends of knights, reminding us that the Middle Ages were not just an age of war, but an era that forged the very foundations of the world we know today.